and because we're looking at everywhere this morning. Don't know if y'all realize, but the word everywhere in our English translations in the New Testament is found about 9 times. Now, the words the world is found a lot more, but incidentally, when you see the word everywhere in the New Testament, about 7 of those times, it's related to the preaching of the gospel and how that the preaching of the gospel was done everywhere. I appreciate Aaron reading for us this morning from Acts chapter 21, for you'll notice there that Paul, after having gone back to Jerusalem, and as he had just made peace with the Jewish brethren there somewhat, he was seized by the Jews, and the big thing that they accused him of was preaching everywhere. And I mean, can you imagine that? He preaches this everywhere. Well, that's what we're looking at this morning, is everywhere. Now, when we look at this idea of everywhere, you'll notice first of all that as Christians, we understand we have a universal mission. We look at the Great Commission. Mark chapter 16, 15 and 16, particularly there in verse 15, he says, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." Wow. That's pretty universal, right? Now, of course, we understand he's talking about every human. He's not talking about preach to the dogs and the cats and the cows and the rats and things, right? He's talking about preach to humans. He says, go into all the world. Now, here at the end of the lesson, we're going to revisit these ideas, but we're going to look at them a little bit differently. Because a lot of times we make a big deal about the go. You know, we say, oh, well, go is a command. We need to go. Well, not saying we don't go, but incidentally, in the original language, go is not actually the command. The command is preach or make disciples. In Matthew chapter 28, verses 19 and 20, there in Matthew's account of the Great Commission, we find that Matthew records Jesus as saying, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." Now that's pretty significant, because if you lived in the ancient times, they didn't have a term that we now have. We have a thing, we call it racial this and racial that and race, right? Do y'all realize that that was invented by a man by the name of Charles Darwin? He's the one who invented this whole idea of race. Before that, yeah, there was still discrimination, but it was based upon your nation or your heritage, not your quote-unquote race. Race is a totally fictitious thing. There is no such thing, because we are all humans, no matter what color our skin is. God created us all. As Paul says in Acts chapter 17, all of one blood. Isn't that fascinating? He says he made of all nations out of one blood. In other words, there is no such thing as multiple races. That's an evolutionary concept. That's not a biblical concept. So do you realize, even if you hate somebody who is a different color than you, you are not technically a racist, because you can't be a racist. You might be a pigmentist, maybe. Even that's stupid, but nonetheless, he said, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." In other words, it doesn't matter what their nationality is. It doesn't matter if they're Hispanic or if they're black or if they're, Bulgarian or what. It doesn't matter. All nations. That's pretty universal. Then in Luke chapter 24, in verse 47, Luke records it a little bit differently. And the thing that I find fascinating about all 3 of these is all 3 of these are recording the words of Jesus. And I don't know how long Jesus talked with his disciples there on that mountain, but I do know that before his ascension, he was giving them these commands. He was giving them these directives. And we're going to look this morning at how they carried that out. But you'll notice, he says repentance and remission of sins should be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. Again, all nations. This is not something just for us. Now, of course, keep in mind, he's talking to Jews who lived in a Jew-centered world. And let me tell you, if there was any group of people who were very much against every other group of people, it was the Jews. You remember when Noah, or not Noah, but Jonah, I'll get my wrong mariners there, but you remember when Jonah was fleeing from God on his way to Tarshish? And you remember what he said? He said, well, I'm a Hebrew. Boy, he was proud of that. He's like, I'm not like y'all. You're just a bunch of pagans. You're sub-Hebrew, And that's the way the Jews looked at it. Keep in mind, Jesus is giving this command directly to Jewish people that they're to go to all the world, all nations, all people, every creature. It's universal. I don't know about y'all, but I think it's kind of good that it's universal. And truthfully, it's kind of a daunting mission. I mean, how many billion people are in the world? I don't know. I don't know. I've never counted them, and quite honestly, I haven't looked at the figures recently, but isn't it somewhere around 20-some billion? I don't know. Maybe not that much. It's a lot of people, though. I know that. Some of y'all may be looking that up right now. Let's see how many people are on the earth. I don't know. It's a lot, right? It's a lot of people. So to think that we have to go to the whole world, whew, man, that's hard. How can we possibly do that? Is it even possible? I don't even know how you get to some places in the world. Some places in the world are very difficult to get to, even though we have air travel and sea travel, and, for that matter, we can even go by burro to some places. We can travel by donkey to some places, and some places you have to. Some places you have to walk into them. There are places in South America, places in Africa, on those two continents that are very difficult to get to. Even in Asia, there are some places in China that are very remote. And it's hard to get to them. Some people might have said back a few years ago, before we had a 4-lane highway coming into Lewis County, they might have said, oh man, it's hard to get to Lewis County. I don't know how you even get to Hohenwald. Well, it's easier now, isn't it? Yeah, it's easier. Easier to get in. It's hard to get out though, right? But nonetheless, this is part of the world. This is part of it. Jesus expects us to go to the world. It's not like this is something that he doesn't want us to do or something that he doesn't really expect. I mean, I want you to think about, have you ever told your children to do something and then not really expect them to do it? You might have. Maybe you've had one particularly messy child and you tell them, hey, I want you to clean your room before this weekend. We've got guests coming over. And then you think to yourself, they're not going to do it. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. They might surprise you. But the fact of the matter is, the Bible tells us there in Matthew chapter 26, and this is rather incidental, but Jesus is talking about the woman who just took the alabaster ointment and she put the ointment all over Jesus. And he said, wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, they're going to talk about this woman. What? Wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world? In other words, Jesus is expecting us to preach to the whole world. In Matthew chapter 24, verse 14, you'll find there it says, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached where? In all the world as a witness to all nations. He says it's going to be done. God's going to see to it. Now the question is, are we going to be part of that? That's a difficult task, maybe. You find in Mark chapter 13, verse 10, Jesus said, and the gospel must first be preached to all the nations. He says, before that day comes, the gospel's got to be preached to everybody. That's our job. That's what he told his disciples. Now, not only is it a daunting mission, but in some respects, it's an easy mission. Now, I know you're probably saying, well, preacher, that doesn't make sense. You mean to tell me it's hard and it's also easy? Well, the hard part is going to all the world, right? I mean, have any of y'all had to fly anywhere recently? I haven't flown in a number of years, partly because it's very expensive to fly. It's very difficult to fly. Some places you've got to get special shots to even fly there. Some places you've got to arrange visas and get government permission to go into their country. It's not easy to go to some places. But the easy part is that the whole world starts right here. You realize this is where the world starts for the people who live right here? You remember he told his disciples, he says, I want the word to be preached to the whole world. And notice where he said starting. He said starting in Jerusalem. Why did he say that? Well, that's where he told them to wait. That's where they were. He said, you're starting where you are. Now, in a very real sense, according to 1 John chapter 5:19, it says the whole world lies under the sway of the wicked one. Is it hard to find people who are lost? No, that's easy. You bump into them every day. You talk to them every day. It's easy to find lost people. In Romans 5 and verse 12, he's talking there about Adam's sin, and then he says death spread to all men because all men have sinned. Romans 3:23, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death. So, is it hard to find people who are lost in their sins, who are facing eternal death? No. That's easy. That's easy. We can find them everywhere. As a matter of fact, in Acts chapter 17 and verse 30, when Paul's preaching there in Athens, he says, you know, at one time God overlooked this ignorance. He winked at it. He says, but now he commands all men, what's that? All men everywhere to repent, because he's appointed a day in which he will judge. So he tells us, he commands all men everywhere to repent. There's people that are lost everywhere, in all nations, in all communities, in all places. That's the easy part, is finding them. Now, the thing of it is, we actually have the remedy. Imagine if you had the cure to cancer. You know, maybe you had in your pocket, you open up your wallet and you pull it out, and you've got the secret cure to cancer. You might have that, you know, that formula written out on a piece of paper. Now, if you had the cure to cancer, do you think that might be valuable to somebody? I guarantee it. Now, I'm going to tell you, I don't have the cure to cancer. And I know there are a lot of people who suffer from cancer, and it's a deadly and terrible disease. We understand that. But if I had the cure to cancer, is that something I should keep to myself? No. I shouldn't keep it to myself. I should have enough humanity about me to want to make sure that I go out there and let every person who has cancer know that, hey, here, I've got the cure right here. All you have to do is follow these directions and do these things, and your cancer can be gone. I should have enough humanity to let them know, right? Well, right here, he's already told us, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. The wages of sin is death. The whole world is under his sway. He's told us there's people out there everywhere who are dying, more people dying of sin than dying of cancer. And what does he say in Romans 1:16? He says, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto what? Salvation to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Wait a minute, what was that, Paul? You mean we've got people in sin everywhere, people dying everywhere, and we have the answer right here? We've got it right here. Why would we keep it to ourselves? That's inhuman. That's unkind. That's unloving. And folks, quite honestly, that's ungodly. Because this is a doable mission. God didn't tell us to do something that we can't do. Quite honestly, He didn't. Can you imagine God saying to us, I want you to live faithfully unto death, but there's no way you can do it, so you're going to die and be lost anyway. He didn't say that, did He? No, this is something we can do. Notice in Luke chapter 9 and verse 6, here's we look at the everywhere. In Luke chapter 9 and verse 6, when Jesus gave the limited commission and he sent the 70 out, and it says they went out and preached where? Everywhere. Now, they were going everywhere to the Jews, so it was limited. But then later, in Mark chapter 16 and verse 20, here Mark talks about commenting after Jesus had ascended, and he kind of skipped over the establishment of the church because maybe through inspiration he knew Luke was going to record that in Acts chapter 1 and 2. Okay? But he kind of just skips over that, and he jumps right to, Jesus went up into heaven, and guess what? They went out everywhere and preached. They went and preached everywhere. That was his main thing. They went out and preached everywhere. They preached the gospel everywhere. Well, no, that makes sense because back up in verse 15, what did He tell them to do? He said, I want you to go everywhere and preach the gospel to every creature. That's what they did. In Acts chapter 8 and verse 4, we find there that the Christians were being persecuted. As a matter of fact, the main leader of that persecution was a man by the name of Saul. He had orders from the high priest, and he was persecuting Christians. The Bible says in Acts chapter 9 that he was making havoc of the church. He was on his way to Damascus to go hunt those Christians down. But notice what happened. When they started being persecuted, where did they go? They went everywhere. Have you ever noticed what happens when you're mowing a field? And in that field, you happen to have some thistle that has gone to flower. You know what I'm talking about, don't you, Richard? Y'all done this before, right? You go around and you go and you cut that thistle down, and what happens? Those seeds go everywhere, just like a dandelion. They go everywhere. You see, that's what happened with the church. When the persecution came, it says that those who were scattered went everywhere preaching the word. Why did they go everywhere preaching the word? Well, number one is because that's what God said to do. But number two, there are lost people everywhere. And the word is the thing that will save them. Because the word is how we access the power of God. Because remember, Romans 1:16, for the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. Where do we find the gospel? We find it right here in this book. They went everywhere preaching the word. That's what they did. As a matter of fact, gospel preaching became so prevalent during that era that the Jews and the Gentiles both were getting kind of upset about it. We talked a little bit about it in class this morning, the idea that it was making such an impact that people were not going to the synagogue as much, so they weren't giving their money. People were not going to the temples of Diana and so on and so forth. You remember when Paul was in Ephesus and he'd been preaching there, and there was a man by the name of Demetrius, and he was a silversmith, and you remember what happened? He said, guys, we got to take care of this. I'm not selling any more of these little Diana idols anymore. He says, my business has dropped off because of these Christians. You remember on one occasion, it said of the Christians, it says, these people who've been teaching the gospel, he says, they've come here, but what did he say? They have turned the world, what? Upside down. He said, they've changed everything we know. We're operating under a whole new dynamic here because of Christians. Do you realize how much better this world is because of Christians? I mean, compare this country to, say, maybe China. Think about the difference. In China, they still practice forced abortions in some places in China. Not everywhere, but in some places. They'll say, well, you can only have 2 children. That's it. If you get pregnant with number 3, killing that kid, whether you like it or you don't. In China, if you have a child born with a disability, they will not give that child care. I know of a couple who was living in China. They were missionaries to China. Well, the wife was born in China. But as they were there, they had a child born with a disability of some sort, some medical problem. And I can't remember what it was now. But I do remember that the Chinese government said, no, we're not going to treat that child because that child is disabled and it's not worth our time to treat them. Let them die. The church raised the money to bring them here back to the States so that the child could get treatment. Why? Because here in the United States, we have a larger influence of Christianity. We have a larger influence of the church, of the gospel. You see, the early Christians went everywhere preaching the gospel to everybody. And because of that, it started to give them trouble. In Acts chapter 28 or 21, verse 28, which Aaron read for us just a little while ago, they were talking about Paul. They says, men of Israel, help! Help us! This man who's here, he's been preaching everywhere against this place. What? That's a problem, y'all, to them. But that's a good problem. Because you see, because of the influence of Christianity, we see things that have gotten better over time instead of worse. In Acts chapter 28, verse 22, they were talking about the Christians, and it says, concerning this sect, we know that it is spoken against everywhere. And yeah, that's the way the Roman government looked at it. The Roman government looked at it as, everywhere you find these Christians, everywhere you find the people that are going by this book, everywhere they go, it upsets the Jews. And the Jews, they won't leave it alone. Everywhere they go, it upsets the pagans. And the pagans, they won't leave it alone because it affects their business. They're spoken against everywhere. There are ancient letters recorded where the Christians have been interrogated and they find out what the problem is with the Christians. They're like, we want to know, what do you people believe? Well, they believe in one God. They believe that Jesus is the Christ. They hold to that and they won't turn from it. They won't worship Caesar. They won't do it. As a matter of fact, that was some of their test. If they won't worship Caesar and they won't give homage to Caesar and they won't give homage to the false gods, then they must be atheists. You realize Christians were called atheists in the early centuries of the church because they weren't believing in the false gods? They were called atheists. That's something. But you see, they had gone everywhere preaching the gospel. It's our mission. I want you to look at these examples from Young's literal translation. If you've ever looked at Young's literal, for the most part, it's pretty good. It's a little difficult to read at times because of the way the syntax works, but nonetheless, he says here, the Young's literal translation from Matthew 28:19, it says, having gone then, disciple all the nations. In other words, the go is not the command, the go is a given. How many of us stay at home all day, every day, and never go anywhere? Maybe a few of us, but I imagine that most of us go somewhere. It's kind of a given. It's human in nature. It's our human nature. We generally go. At least ever since Babel, right? You remember in the Tower of Babel and how that the people were gathered there all around this tower, and they said, hey, let's build a tower up into the heavens and we're going to make a great name among all those in future generations. We're going to make a great name among for ourselves. God says, no. I told you to scatter. I told you to go. They didn't want to go. So God confounded their language and He sent them everywhere. And ever since then, humans have been going everywhere. That's what we do. Well, He says, having gone, or as you're going, disciple the nations. It should be incidental, should be second nature. As you go, Tell people about Jesus. Having gone to all the world, Mark 16:15, having gone to all the world. In other words, you're going somewhere. As you go, proclaim the good news to all the creation. As you go, tell people. Isn't that what they did in the first century? Look at that. Having gone then, having gone to all the world. It's incidental. The going is not the command. The preaching is, the teaching is. And you're going to go somewhere because everywhere starts right here. Right here is everywhere. In your community, in Homewall, in Lewis County. And then you just expand out wherever you go. I know some of you go to Columbia from time to time. I see you there catching me by my Snickers bar candy. Yes, I know you go. And I know some of you go to Nashville from time to time, right? It happens. As you go, teach. We must start where we are. Because the fact of the matter is, when we stop growing, we start dying. Happens as a congregation. You think about the congregation right here at Flat Rock. I don't know how many we have this morning, but just looking out, I'm going to guess somewhere in the neighborhood of 35-ish. Going to be my guess. I know that Brantley's going to get us an official count here in a little while. He may already know. But nonetheless, am I close to 35? Is that close? Maybe? I don't know. No? I don't know. He'll write it back there in a little while. And we'll know how many we had here this morning. But I do know this, that if this congregation doesn't grow, what's going to happen to this congregation in a number of years? Richard goes, that's right. It'll just die. Because here's the thing of it. In a number of years, let's say 40 years from now, how many of us are likely not going to be here? The most of us, right? Most of us, 40 years from now, will not be here. 40 years from now, I won't be here, I don't think. And if I am, I'm going to be 90 years old, which means I'm probably not going to be able to do a whole lot. But 40 years from now, I'm likely not to be here. 40 years from now, I see all of you with the white hair. Love you, but you probably won't be here 40 years from now. It's a fact of the matter. What happens if we don't replace those of us who are here? If we don't grow? We die, right? We die. We're gone. You see, we have an obligation to carry out God's Great Commission. Now, I don't want to leave you with the false impression that it's going to be an easy thing or that we won't have to step out of our comfort zone. We may. We might have to do some things that are a little uncomfortable to us. It's not always easy to talk with someone about their sin. But the fact of the matter is, it's necessary. Because we all have encountered sin. I mean, we all here, every one of us, we know what it's like to have been in sin and now to be redeemed. We know that, right? Don't we want that for everybody else? I want to encourage you this morning. If you're not taking the gospel to others, don't hold that in. Carry it to others. Share it with others. And it doesn't have to be a difficult thing. Now, I understand you might not be the kind of person who's going to sit down one-on-one with somebody and sit across the table and open up the Bible and do a Bible study. Sometimes, maybe that's not your thing. I get it. We all have different strengths and weaknesses. But can we all invite somebody to come here? I think we can do that. Particularly on a first Sunday, right? I mean, that's pretty easy. We can invite somebody to come on the first Sunday. And, you know, if I know that a congregation is committing to inviting people here on the first Sunday, I promise you every first Sunday, we're going to have evangelism-based lessons that are going to teach people the gospel. We can do that. I appreciate those of you who have invited others. I know like Jeff invites folks from the campground from time to time, and I know Kay's invited people, and I know Richard invited. I know probably all of you are, and I just don't know about everybody's invitations, but that's a good thing. That's a good start, right? When I was at PTP, came across a thing called School of Evangelism, House School of Evangelism. And I would love to share that with y'all, just maybe some Wednesday or something, or maybe, some Sunday evening, just share that with you. It's fascinating because he's broken it down to a system of 3 different groups of people within the church. He calls them bringers, savers, or is it savers? I don't know. Bringers, I don't know. I think it's bringers, savers, and keepers. Bringers, teachers, and keepers. That's what it is. Bringers, teachers, and keepers. I'll get it straight here in a minute. But he says, there are some of us who bring people to church. We invite and we bring people, but we may not be the ones to sit down and study with them. He says the teachers will do that. And there are some of us here who have the capability to teach. He said, then there are keepers. Those that once somebody is converted, we keep encouraging them and following up with them and helping them and things. And some of us are really good at that, right? We're all good at something. We can all play a part. But if anyone here has needed the invitation is always open because it's to all men everywhere. God invites us. Won't you please come while together we stand and while we sing?